Waldy and Bendy.
Hello, and welcome to Waldy and Bendy's Adventures in Art, the podcast they couldn't stop. I'm Waldemar Januszczak, art critic of the Sunday Times, but as no one can say Waldemar Januszczak, you can call me Waldy. And I'm joined in these adventures by a man who's been everything in life. An art dealer, an art historian, a man on a motorbike, and now he's on the telly all the time. He is, of course, Bendy Grosvenor, who I think is up in Scotland. Is that right, Bendy?
Hello, yes, here I am. I'm trying many professions in life to master something at last, but we keep going.
And you are in Scotland?
I am. Very nice.
You're a lucky man, I tell you. You're a lucky man to be up there. But we are lucky too because we've got this podcast and we've got art, and art saves us in these difficult times. And later in the podcast, we'll be looking at Grayson Perry's new TV show, Grayson Perry's Art Club, and choosing the pictures we'd like to have on our walls if we could have absolutely anything. First, though, an artist who should be having a big show at the moment at the National Gallery in London, but who's yet another victim of the great lockdown. So, no show. But that doesn't stop us talking about her, and she is, of course, Artemisia Gentileschi. Bendy, Artemisia, yay or nay?
Oh, very much yay. But isn't it extraordinary that this was going to be the first ever exhibition of her in the UK? I mean, talk about ignoring an artist for centuries. What do you think?
Well, she's been refound, hasn't she? It's happened to a lot of artists in recent times. I think her work was scattered about. She just didn't have an identity. So it's not that people deliberately set out to ignore her. She just wasn't a very tangible presence. I suspect that's really the main reason, because when you do see her best work in a group, I think it's pretty obvious straight away, really, what an enormous contribution she made.
I was just... I thought I would check, actually, to see if she appeared in my Gombrich, in Gombrich's Story of Art. And she doesn't. Not even a footnote. And I think it's rather sad that she has been ignored by art history for so long. But then that is the criticism, isn't it, that's always made of the canon in art, that it was something shaped by male connoisseurs, male artists and male art historians for centuries. And when you see the example of Artemisia Gentileschi, and you see very quickly in only a few works just how good she was, then I think there is much validity to the criticism of the concept of the canon. What do you think?
Well, of course that's true, and men have written the canon and they have certainly favoured other men. But that isn't the only thing that's going on. That's all I would say on that. I mean, Vermeer was forgotten for 3 centuries. And, you'd look at a Vermeer and you'd think, now, how is it possible to forget Vermeer? Rembrandt even was overlooked for a couple of centuries. These things do happen. Great talents have slipped down the back of the settee. Caravaggio even, wasn't appreciated so much during the age of Raphael. And I think with Artemisia is that, I mean, even now, there have been a couple of great discoveries in the past 3 or 4 years of wonderful pictures by her. This picture at the National Gallery of her self-portrait of St. Catherine, that's only been bought at auction recently. And there's another one that went to America, to the Wadsworth Athenaeum, of a self-portrait of her as a lute player. So all I'm trying to say really is that it's not just that she's been underappreciated, although that is obviously an issue, but also she hasn't been seen properly. We haven't had a clear enough idea of her career to be able to really evaluate her.
Yes, and I think for someone who fancies himself as a bit of an art sleuth, it's one of the reasons I find her a very exciting artist, because there's always a possibility that you might just find a stonking work by a great artist still. In fact, I could tell you about one I missed only a couple of years ago. It was bought by a friend of mine who's a collector. He's a financier by day and an art collector by night. And he was just going through some auction catalogues and found this picture online in Germany. I thought it looked a bit like an Artemisia. And lo and behold, it was. It's a portrait of David and Goliath. And rather nicely, it's even signed Artemisia Gentileschi, so there's absolutely no doubt about it. And so he made the most extraordinary discovery just on a hunch.
That sounds unlikely to me, indeed. But did you see there's a big show of hers in Rome about 2 or 3 years ago now? In fact, it was in the Quirinale Palace, where the Raphael show is at the moment. I saw it. Did you see that show?
I did. I had just chanced upon it. I was in Rome with my wife and daughter on a short break, and there it was. And it was one of my favourite exhibitions I've ever been to, partly because I wasn't expecting to see it, and partly because, I'm ashamed to say, I wasn't expecting the pictures to be quite so good. I was particularly struck actually by her portraits. And often it seems, and I don't know how subjective one can be about this, often it seems that her story and her appreciation of her art is overshadowed by the tragedy of her life and her rape as a teenager and her torture and trial and all that. And we focus on the religious pictures. Um, but actually, for me, the pictures that stood out in that exhibition were the portraits, um, because she just brings such a different gaze. Brings a different perspective to the pictures she paints and the portraits she paints. I particularly liked the portrait of a lady with a fan, mainly because it just had such extraordinary attitude. And a male artist would never have painted a woman in that manner. The sitter, who unfortunately we don't know, looks like she's just about to waltz onto the dance floor, and Bee Gees' Saturday Night Fever is playing in the background. There's a huge disco beat. And here's this woman comes sashaying out with her fan and her dress and her fingers pointed to say, "Here I am. Don't mess with me."
Yes, I suppose that's true. I actually thought there were some very weak pictures in that Rome show, and I suspect that the real reason for that is that they probably weren't by her, and it's going back to this idea that we haven't got a very clear sense yet of exactly what she achieved. But for me, the pictures that are, as it were, unarguable Artemisia are these ones where she casts herself in this role of a sort of protagonist in her own art. But emotionally, she does that in these scenes of violence against men. I mean, obviously, one of her most celebrated pictures is the Judith and Holofernes, where she's cutting off the head of Holofernes. Well, she isn't, but her heroine, as it were, is. And inevitably, the modern world empathizes with that. And in the kind of Me Too world in which we live, that's a heroic picture, and it's understood in that way. But the quieter ones, the National Gallery's new St. Catherine, for example, they are so fabulous because she presents herself as St. Catherine, so it's a self-portrait. So you've got all that whole personal identity thing tugging you towards it. But there's also just this extra fire to it, this identification with a Christian martyr, with a saint from the past. You know, it just gives the picture this extra fire. It's so interesting, this mental compulsion you feel to engage with her. And there's the other new one that was found recently. The I think it's a Saint Cecilia. Or they're calling it a woman with a lute, but I'm sure it's a self-portrait of Saint Cecilia, so another martyr. That's got it too. And then that fantastic picture as Pittura, as the embodiment of art in the Royal Collection, where she is the embodiment of art. And there's
Mm.
just something about this bringing of yourself to art, making yourself the focus of it, that makes her art especially compelling.
Mm. I know what you mean. And actually, there's something really interesting about that self portrait with the lute that you just mentioned, which now belongs to the Wadsworth Athenaeum in the United States. I remember a few years ago it came up for sale in New York. I think it was at Christie's, and the estimate was quite reasonable. I say quite reasonable. I think it was around about $1 million. But um, the extraordinary thing is it didn't sell. And this was, I think, 4 or 5 years ago. And it's just a really interesting reflection of how belated people have grasped the idea of how important Artemisia Gentileschi was. Because even 5, 10 years ago, people were still slightly shrugging their shoulders at her impact on art history.
Mm. Well, it's back to this idea of old men having written the canon, and we've got a bit of a cheek talking about this because basically we're a pair of old blokes talking about the canon as well. But I did a poster recently for the Sunday Times, and it was my history of art. It was one of these sort of free gifts that people were getting during the Great Lockdown. And boy, did I get it in the neck from various feminist readers who are quite rightly pointing out that I should have had more women artists. And in contemporary art, you can find them. There are great artists, lots of them, who are women artists who can be appreciated by everybody and who are being appreciated. In the past, it's just trickier. I mean, there are just fewer of them. And however much we may regret the fact that women were largely written out of the story, the fact is that is what happened. And there are just not that many women artists whom we can find. You know, we've got Michaelina Wotier, we talked about her on this show. You know, you've got Judith Leister, you've got Rachel Royce in the great Dutch Golden Age. But you are looking at only a few examples, and Artemisia is almost the embodiment of them, isn't she?
She is, but all the more reason why we should do what we can to rewrite them back into the story. In fact, a little plug, something I'm quite proud of, is that last year I curated and put on the first ever exhibition of Britain's female 17th century artists. That was the first time it had ever been done in the UK. So people like Mary Beale and Anne Killigrew, who was an extraordinary, fascinating poet painter who died when she was only 24.
Mm. I love Mary Beale. Mary Beale's really interesting. She's part of that world that I love, the world of William Dobson. Very intriguing artist. So there's a lot. I think we should look at it as a positive. There's a
Hmm.
lot of great female art out there waiting still, not just to be discovered, but also to be reevaluated. So I think we should see that as something that we can look forward to. And of course, we regret the past. We regret the artists that have been forgotten, but there are just things on the horizon that look pretty good to me.
Yeah.
Anyway, on that positive note, that's the end of Artemisia. I believe the show has, by the way, been rethought and restructured and rescheduled, so it is coming up at some point in the future. It just should have been on now, and it isn't, which is a big regret. However, there is a lot of stuff that is on right now, particularly on the internet, as we're going to find out in the next section of the podcast.
Isolation.
So, Bendor, I know you've been sitting in your living room wondering what to do. And like me, you've been saved by art because you have to admit there's an awful lot of art now on the internet. Lots of things one can find, lots of interesting things to watch from the safety and comfort of your own living room. So, what have you been looking at?
I have been looking at something that absolutely fascinates me in the whole art game, and that is conservation. The Metropolitan Museum in New York has a little channel on YouTube which is dedicated to the topic of conservation. It's called Conserving Art at the Met. And there's a lot of lovely videos to see. There's how they're fixing a tear in a Michelangelo drawing. And extraordinarily, there's how they repaired a full-size marble statue by Tullio Lombardo, which was made in 1490 of Adam, which smashed to the ground about 8 or 9 years ago. And they had to painstakingly glue it all back together. But the most interesting one is a series of videos about the cleaning of a painting by Charles Lebrun, a huge monumental painting of the art collector Everhard Jabach and his family, which the Met bought a few years ago, and it was absolutely filthy, and it needed relining, it needed all sorts of TLC done to it. But the most wonderful bits of the film are when the conservators apply their swabs and their magic solutions, and with a few gentle strokes, they reveal something that hasn't been seen for 300 or 400 years, the artist's original colors and brushstrokes and technique. And it's just breathtaking to see it.
It's right up your street, isn't it? Because of the TV program that you do, Britain's Lost Masterpieces, you're always dabbling in restoration, aren't you? It's your world, isn't it?
Yes, I flatter myself sometimes that people might tune in to see that film because I might discover the odd picture. But actually, what they really want to see is our restorer, Simon Gillespie, and the extraordinary before and after transformation that he can wield with a tiny little swab. And I think it's the reason people like it so much is that the smallest little change to a painting, removing a bit of dirt or overpaint, can make the biggest impact to its meaning. So in the past, we have cleaned off little bits of overpaint, and then suddenly there's a whole signature underneath. We had some pictures by Peter Bruegel Younger, and someone had not only overpainted half the animals in the picture, but also the signature, and it was just Simon surgically removing all these layers, which transformed the painting and their story.
Mm. It's a very interesting moment in restoration because, I mean, I remember only what, 5 years ago, let's say 10 years ago for sure, people didn't like to talk about restoration. I remember filming a Giorgione film once, and we went to Venice, and they were restoring the Castelfranco Madonna, which is one of his earliest masterpieces. And I remember they wouldn't let us film it because, the first stage of restoration can look very brutal. You've
Yeah.
taken off all the old paint, and there's these massive, great gaps left in the canvas, and it can be frightening. And that was the stage this picture was at. And the woman, I remember, she was a very sort of bellicose director of the Accademia in Venice, just would not let us anywhere near it. And that happened to various degrees in quite a lot of art at that time. And yet recently, the opposite's happened. They've made a big deal of these restorations. The Ghent altarpiece, which was the great Van Eyck, was being restored in Ghent. That became a public event. They built this giant glass studio, and we all poured in, looking through the glass, watching every move. They did the same with Rembrandt's Night Watch, and I think it's like, have you seen that program on the telly that's very popular now called The Repair Shop?
I've seen one or two. Yeah, in
Uh,
fact, I think Simon's been on it.
Has he, yeah, well, somebody brings some stuff in and people restore it. So there's a lovely storytelling to be told usually about the object, but also people are just interested in the way things come back to life. And I think museums have discovered this. And I loved that Met site that you talked about there, which you have all the details on the Sunday Times web pages afterwards. So you can turn to that and look at them. And I saw a film about them restoring a carpet, and it was just brilliant. It was this Persian carpet from the 16th century. So interesting. So the processes are really intriguing, and all that nervousness that people used to have about revealing what restoration involves proved to be unnecessary. It's actually really fascinating, isn't it?
Yeah, and I'm so glad museums have got over this because you're right. They used to be terribly neurotic about it, and I don't know what they were afraid of. Perhaps people didn't understand that paintings that have been around for 400 or 500 years have been bashed about a bit, but the public actually is quite accepting of that. So there's no reason to be quite so concerned about it.
No, there isn't. Anyway, I've been looking at something else. I've been watching the telly actually, and watching Grayson Perry's Art Club, which is on Channel 4. It's on Mondays. Now, I've seen a few of these art clubs now, and various people have started them. It's an obvious thing to do in a way. You know, there's a lot of homeschooling going on in the world at the moment, and art is one of those things that it's relatively fun to do. So, Grayson Perry's show, basically, he comes in. It's filmed in his studio at home. And people have been asked to send in stuff. The theme this week was portraits, so people sent in their portraits, and Grayson did various things to do with portraiture. So he got in a couple of people who are told are famous comedians, although I've never heard of them. There's somebody called Joe Lycett who did a picture of the of Chris Whitty, you know, the man who's on every night on the telly telling us to watch our health, and another comedian called Keith Lemon, I think I have heard of, and he did a portrait of a pop star or something. So comedians are on every art program now, aren't they? So it wasn't a surprise to
Mhm.
see them on this one, but it was a charming program, and I thought the thing I almost liked most about it was, you know, when you see Grayson Perry out and about in his Claire outfit and he's wearing his full-on drag, he's one kind of person. But in this program, he's another kind of person. He's just at home. He looks like he could do with a haircut. He certainly could do with a good combing of his hair. And he's with his wife, Philippa, who's also incredibly interesting. She's a well-known psychologist, you know, and she's written books, and she's a big presence herself. But their relationship is lovely. You know, they're so fond of each other, and he does a picture of her, and she talks to him so nicely. It was just a very intimate and lovely portrayal, and it sort of didn't have some of that archness that you get in so many of these art programs. So that part of it I liked. I don't know if you saw it, if you like that.
I did. Actually, I could have watched Grayson and Philippa for the whole hour. I didn't particularly care for the celebs coming in with their not particularly good pictures. I could have watched them. I thought they were lovely to watch.
I have one issue though, right? I mean, I do think it's a marvelous event. I love Grayson, and I thought the program was fun. But at the end, he says something that, to be honest, sent a bit of a shiver through me. Right? He said,
Mm,
I've had all these people on, I've chosen all these artworks, they're all going to go into this exhibition. And what have I learned from making this program? He said, the thing I've taken away is that it's not important to get a likeness from a portrait. Now, now that hurt me,
mhm.
actually, because I think it is important to get a likeness from a portrait, at least on the level that I'm interested in art. Now, of course, if you're talking about art as a kind of nursery experience where people can do whatever they want and it's just fun and throw around the paints, fine. But if you're talking about something more than that, if you're talking about the kind of art that in the end societies are judged by, the stuff that we look back from 500 years ago and say that's important because, you know, if you're looking at that, then uh, surely ground zero in portraiture is to get a likeness. And it's part of this thing we have at the moment where there's a kind of war against expertise going on, a war against proper sort of professionalism and knowledge. And I'm not saying that Grayson does that deliberately, but I think there's an element of it. And you know, you could trace a line from this attitude that says, "Oh, you know, anybody can do a portrait. You don't need to get a likeness." You could trace a line from that to President Trump appearing on the telly and saying we should all inject ourselves with disinfectant because I know a lot about science. You
Mhm.
know, there's a thing going on where I think we need to watch it. We need to be careful about how much we value people's genuine knowledge as opposed to just their enthusiasm, etc. Now that casts me as the pantomime baddie in this argument, but I do believe that.
Well, I have to say I agree with you. We're rapidly turning into the who are those two old Muppets? Were they called Waldorf and Statler? Waldy and Bendy. We're like them, aren't we? I mean, I did enjoy the show, but I just kept wanting to have a little moment of Grayson saying, "This is actually how you do it. Here's some technique tips. Here's how you draw a face." But I wasn't quite getting that. And at this point, perhaps I should reveal myself as a fan. On the BBC iPlayer, you can tune into Bob Ross's Joy of Painting classes. Have you seen any of those?
I haven't,
Oh,
no.
they are
I've been told I
tremendous.
must.
They're really good. They're short, and he's a great communicator. Of course, these were made in the 1970s, and he's there in this huge frizzy haircut, and there's lots of sort of American supermarket music in the background. But they're mesmerizing, and you do actually learn quite a lot, as well as being sort of uplifted spiritually inside. Um, so you don't get all the gags and celebs that you do with Grayson Perry's show, but you do actually learn something about how to paint a painting.
Well, that's valuable, isn't it? Let's face it. Anyway, what we're all agreed on is that there's plenty to watch in isolation. But we don't have to just do that because we can also get to choose what we want in our walls in the next section of the podcast. On the wall. So here we are, back again, Bendor, in the museum without walls, where we can have anything we want hanging in front of us right now, because that's the magic of the podcast. So what have you chosen for us this week?
I'm afraid I'm getting a little bit punch drunk on the concept of having our own private museums. I need a bigger and bigger hit. It's a bit like drinking coffee. You need more and more to get the same buzz, don't you? So this week I've gone for Tintoretto's Crucifixion, which is 12 meters long. It's from the Scuola Grande di San Rocco in Venice. So we're going to have to build an extension for my museum in order to fit this one in. Um, One of the reasons I've chosen it is that there's a little bit of a theme emerging in my picks. Um, is that San Rocco was invoked against the plague in the 16th century. So I think that would be quite helpful to have one of those paintings. But this is unquestionably for me Tintoretto's masterpiece. It's very quickly painted. His nickname was Il Furioso, and the painting is a swirling mass of people and action. Uh, and there in the middle is Christ on the cross, crucified. And unlike most crucifixion pictures, where Christ is shown sort of resigned to his fate, Tintoretto's Christ looks really quite annoyed to be up there nailed to a cross. And in amongst all the action, in order to stop the composition being overwhelmed by so many people and so many little storylines unfolding before us, Tintoretto introduces a number of really quite eye-catching straight lines. It's very geometric. There's someone pulling a huge rope to pull the crosses up, and then there's a ladder on the floor. And these are all needed in order to make a 12-meter long painting actually have some sense of coherence and to guide your eye into it. So for me, it's one of the paintings that you can stare at for hours and hours and hours. If the Renaissance ever had a drive-in cinema, it was this picture. So I'm having it in my museum. I'm going to bring out the popcorn and I'm going to sit down in front of it for a good few hours at a time.
See, I can see another theme emerging here, right? This last week you talked about Bellini's beautiful Pesaro triptych, right, which is in the Friary Church. If you walk out of the Friary Church for about 100 feet or so, you go into the Scuola San Rocco, up the stairs, and there's the Tintoretto. You have moved 100 feet in the last two of these big choices. Basically, you want to stay in Venice all your life, and you want to go between the Friary and the
Mhm.
Scuola San Rocco, and that seems to be about it, Bendy.
Well, I've got a good deal from the art transporters. They're in Venice, so I thought while they're there, they could just load everything up for me and bring it home.
It is interesting that you mentioned the cinematic presence of the Tintoretto. Now, see, this is the really interesting thing about it for me. If you remember where it hangs in this room at the end of the top floor of the Scuola San Rocca. So you go through this huge assembly room with all the Tintorettos on the roof, and then you turn left into this smaller sort of chapel space, which is long and thin. The painting isn't at the thin end of it, it's at the long end of it. So you're confronted by this rather short space. I mean, between you and the picture is a short space. So it is like a giant cinema screen. And he's obviously designed it to work that way, because you're almost like looking up at it, pressed up against it, as if you're in sort of row 3 of the Odeum. And it does develop sideways that way. So you've got the giant Christ in the middle with this rather strange slightly spooky pose where he's got his arms stretched out in quite a sort of muscular fashion. And then all this stuff happening on either side. So it's a fantastic piece of cinematic theatre. Such a compelling image, immediately dramatic, isn't it?
I love it. I love that room. And there in the ceiling above it is the painting which transformed Tintoretto's life, actually, because there's a famous story about how he got the gig to paint all those pictures in the Scuola Grande. Um, there was a competition as to who could paint the starter image, if you like, of San Rocco. And most artists just did a little sketch or a study and sent that in. Tintoretto didn't do things like that. He painted the finished picture himself. And he then broke into the Scuola Grande at night and installed it in the ceiling. And so they had to give him the job. And thereafter, he painted every picture in the building and changed his life.
It's a wonderful experience going to that place. I certainly recommend it. But I'm going to continue with the isolation theme, but slightly differently, because I've gone for a Picasso. A Picasso painted in Paris in 1943, so during the German occupation. Now, this German occupation, I don't think was anything like as severe as our lockdown. In fact, I know it wasn't. But there were restrictions, and Picasso did stay in Paris. A lot of French artists left. Matisse, for instance, went to Nice, stayed in the south of France. But Picasso, because he was such an arrogant so-and-so, he stayed in Paris, he looked the Germans in the eyes, and he carried on working in these very difficult conditions. There were shortages of paint, there were shortages of food, there were shortages of fire, there were shortages of everything, but he stayed and he sort of toughed it out. And I love that about him. And this particular image I've chosen, it's called a Still Life with a Skull, Sea Urchins and a Lamp. And it's a very bare image. It's just a table and these sort of black outlined objects on it, done with a spiky cubist style. So there's this particularly sort of dramatic, wobbly skull. There's the lamp, which is throwing a rather weak grey light on everything, as if there isn't much paraffin around and it just feels bleak. And then there is this plate, a wobbly sort of cubisty plate with 3 sea urchins on it, or perhaps it's the same sea urchin with bits taken out of it. Now, sea urchin, have you ever eaten sea urchin, Bendor?
No, I haven't. Should I?
Well, listen to this, right? I have eaten them, and they're a delicacy now. They're quite expensive. You have to go to the south of France to get them, or Japan, where they love them. But during the war, I mean, I imagine they were incredibly hard to get in Paris. But he's obviously found one somewhere or other. But it's like when you see them on the plate, there's these 3 precious bits, and the inside of a sea urchin, there's enough food to feed a blue tit or something. You'd have trouble filling a tiny teaspoon with the bit of sea urchin that you can eat. But on this plate, he's sort of proudly laid them out. And this delicacy has been turned into a symbol of poverty, into a symbol of sparseness. And because it's spiky, the sea urchin, it's got something of a crown of thorns about it. Anyway, my big point is that during this time of lockdown in Paris, Picasso produced, I think, some of his best still lifes. And there are still lives that are imbued with the character of the lockdown. They're sparse, they're grey, they're harsh. They are pictures that seem to me to capture the spirit of the moment. And that moment speaks to our moment. That's what I love about it.
Good. I must say, it's not a picture that would cheer me up very much. So it's not something I would have on my wall. It's definitely in the private Waldy wing.
Well, that's so harsh of you. But anyway, I will tell you what, I will look at it a lot in my private Waldy wing, my little private Waldy wing, while you build your gigantic extension for the Tintoretto. I'll be skulking around the back looking at my Picasso. But I'm going to enjoy doing that over the next week or so. So until we meet again, Bendy, I'm off to look at the Picasso. Looking forward to the next show.
See you soon.
Waldy and Bendy.